Section 1 of the Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford. Section 1. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was born in Frankfurt on August 28, 1749. His parents were citizens of that imperial town, and Wolfgang was their only son. His father was born on July 31st, 1710. He married on August 20th, 1748, at the age of 38, Catherine Elizabeth Textor. In December 1750 was born a daughter, Cornelia, who remained until her death at the age of 27, her brother's most intimate friend. She was married in 1773 to John George Schlosser. Goethe's education was irregular. French culture gave at this time the prevailing tone to Europe. Goethe could not have escaped its influence, and he was destined to fall under it in a special manner. In the 7 Years' War, which was now raging, France took the side of the Empire against Frederick the Great. Frankfurt was full of French soldiers, and a certain Comte Johann, who was courted in Goethe's house, had an important influence on the boy. Goethe, if we may believe his autobiography, experienced his first love about the age of 15 in the person of Gretchen, whom some have supposed to be the daughter of an innkeeper at Offenbach. He worshipped her as Dante worshipped Beatrice. In the autumn of 1765, Goethe travelled to Leipzig. On the 19th of October he was admitted as a student. He was sent to Leipzig to study law, in order that he might return to Frankfurt fitted for the regular course of municipal distinction. He intended to devote himself not to law, but to belles lettres. He attended Gellert's lectures on literature, and even joined his private class. His real university education was derived from intercourse with his friends. First among these was J.G. Schlosser, who afterwards married his sister. He had a great influence upon him, chiefly in introducing him to a wider circle of German, French, English, and Italian poetry. But the person who had the strongest effect on Goethe's mental development was Adam Friedrich Oeser, at this time director of the Academy of Arts in Leipzig. Goethe from his earliest years was never without a passion, and at Leipzig his passion was Kitty Schönkopf, the ancient of the autobiography, the daughter of the host at whose house he dined. She often teased him with her inconstant ways, and to this experience is due his first drama, Die Laune des Verliebten, Lovers' Quarrels, as it may be styled. A deeper chord is struck in Die Mitschuldigen, the fellow sinners, which forms a dismal and forbidding picture both of the time and of the experiences of the youth who wrote it. He had an opportunity of establishing his principles of taste during a short visit at Dresden, in which he devoted himself to the pictures and the antiques. The end of Goethe's stay at Leipzig was saddened by illness. One morning, at the beginning of the summer, he was awakened by a violent hemorrhage. For several days he hung between life and death, and after that his recovery was slow. He left Leipzig far from well on August the 28th, 1768. Goethe made an enforced stay of a year and a half. It was, perhaps, the least happy part of his life. His cure proceeded slowly, and he had several relapses. His family relations were not pleasant. His father showed but little sympathy with his aspirations for universal culture, and could imagine no career for him but that of a successful jurist. His sister had grown somewhat harsh and cold during his absence. Goethe's mother was always the same to him, a bright, genial, sympathetic friend. Goethe, during his illness, received great attention from Fräulein von Klettenberg, a friend of his mother's, a pietist of the Moravian school. She initiated him into the mystical writings of those abstracted saints, and she engaged him in the study of alchemy, which served at once to prepare him for the conception of Faust and for the scientific researches of his later days. He arrived at Strasbourg April 2nd, 1770. Goethe stayed in Strasbourg till August 28th, 1771, his 22nd birthday, and these 16 months are perhaps the most important of his life. During them he came into active contact with most of those impulses of which his afterlife was the development. If we would understand his mental growth, we must ask who were his friends. He took his meals at the house of the Fräulein Lauth in the Kramergasse. The table was mainly filled with medical students. At the head of it sat Salzmann, a grave man of 50 years of age. His experience and his refined taste were very attractive to Goethe, who made him his intimate friend. The table of the Fräulein Lauth received some new guests. Among these was Jung Stilling, the self-educated charcoal burner, who in his memoir has left a graphic account of Goethe's striking appearance, in his broad brow, his flashing eye, his mastery of the company, and his generosity. Another was Lerse, a frank, open character who became Goethe's favourite, and whose name is immortalized in Götz von Berlichingen. Goethe's stay at Strasbourg is generally connected still more closely with another circumstance, his passion for Friederike Brion of Sesenheim. The village lies about 20 miles from Strasbourg, and her father was a pastor there. Goethe was introduced by his friend Wieland as a poor theological student. The father was a simple, worthy man. The eldest of the 3 daughters was married, the 2 younger remained, Maria Salome and Friederike, to whom the poet principally devoted himself. She was tall and slight, with fair hair and blue eyes, and just 16 years of age. Goethe gave himself up to the passion of the moment. During the winter of 1770, Goethe often rode over to Sesenheim. Neither storm, nor cold, nor darkness kept him back. As his time for leaving Strasbourg came nearer, he felt that his love was merely a dream, and could have no serious termination. Friederike felt the same on her side. On August 6th, Goethe took his degree as a Doctor of Law. Shortly afterwards he bade adieu to Sesenheim. Friederike lived till 1813 and died single. Goethe's return to Frankfurt is marked by a number of songs, of which the Wanderers Sturmlied is the most remarkable. He had outgrown many of the friends of his youth. Those with whom he felt most sympathy were the 2 Schlossers and his sister Cornelia. he found in her one who sympathized with all his aspirations. The work into which he threw all his genius was the dramatization of the history of the imperial knight of the Middle Ages, Gottfried, or Goetz, von Berlichingen. The immediate cause of this enterprise was his enthusiasm for Shakespeare. After reading him, he felt, he said, like a blind man who suddenly receives his sight. The study of a dry and dull biography of Goetz, published in 1731, supplied the subject for his awakened powers. From this miserable sketch, he conceived within his mind a complete picture of Germany in the 16th century. The chief characters of his play are creatures of his imagination, representing the principal types which made up the history of the time. Every personage is made to live. They speak in short, sharp sentences, like the powerful lines of a great master's drawing. The first sketch of Goetz was finished in 6 weeks in the autumn of 1771. It ran like wildfire through the whole of Germany. Goethe left Frankfurt in the spring of 1772 for Wetzlar, a quiet country town on the Lahn, one of the seats of government of the Holy Roman Empire. The emperors lived at Vienna, they were crowned at Frankfurt, they held their parliaments at Ratisbon, and at Wetzlar their courts of justice. It was the custom for young lawyers to attend the sittings of these courts for a certain time, before they could be admitted to practice on their own account. The company of these students, of the embassies from the component parts of the empire, and of various imperial officials, made the society a pleasant and lively one. Goethe soon found friends. His favourite house was occupied by one of the officials of the order, by name Buff, an honest man with a large family of children. The second daughter, Lotte, blue-eyed, fair, and just 20 years of age, was first met by Goethe shortly after his arrival at a ball at Walpratshausen. She strongly attracted him. He became a constant visitor at the house. He found that Lotte was a second mother to her brothers and sisters. Lotte was really, though not formally, engaged to Kestner, a man of 32, secretary to the Hanoverian legation. The discovery of this relation made no difference to Goethe. He remained the devoted friend to both, but the position was too critical to last. On September the 10th they met in the German house for the last time. Goethe and Schlosser went together to Wetzlar in November. Here he heard of the death of Jerusalem, a young man attached to the Brunswick legation. He had been with Goethe at the University of Leipzig. Of a moody temperament, disheartened by failure in his profession, and soured by a hopeless passion for the wife of another, he had borrowed a pair of pistols under pretence of a journey, and had shot himself on the night of October the 29th. Goethe immediately afterwards began his Werther. Goethe tells us that it was written in 4 weeks. In October it spread over the whole of Germany. It was enthusiastically beloved or sternly condemned. It was printed, imitated, translated into every language of Europe. Goetz and Werther formed the solid foundation of Goethe's fame. It is difficult to imagine that the same man could have produced both works, so different are they in matter and style. Goetz was the first manly appeal to the chivalry of German spirit, which, caught up by other voices, sounded throughout the fatherland like the call of a warder's trumpet, till it produced a national courage founded on the recollection of an illustrious past, which overthrew the might of the conqueror at the moment when he seemed about to dominate the world. Werther, as soft and melodious as Plato, was the first revelation to the world of that marvellous style which, in the hands of a master, compels a language which is as rich as Greek to be also as musical. The spring of 1773, which witnessed the publication of Goethe, saw him actively employed as an advocate. In November, Goethe's sister Cornelia was married to Schlosser and left Strasbourg. Goethe felt the loss deeply. She lived but a short time. Her married life was tortured with suffering, and she died in 1777. The summer of 1774 was spent in a journey to the Rhine. Goethe returned to Frankfurt at the beginning of August. On December the 11th, Goethe was surprised by the visit of a stranger. It was Karl Ludwig von Knebel, who was travelling with the two princes of Saxe-Weimar, the reigning Duke, Karl August, then just 17, and his younger brother, Constantine. This meeting decided the future course of Goethe's life. He now came under the influence of Lili Schönemann, the daughter of a rich banker. This passion seemed to be of a more lasting nature than the others. Neither family approved of the engagement between the youthful couple. Goethe tore himself away and went for a tour in Switzerland. He returned to Frankfurt on July the 20th. August was spent delightfully with Lili at Offenbach. His letters speak of nothing but her. He wrote some scenes in Faust, the walk in the garden, the first conversation with Mephistopheles, the interview with the scholar, the scene in Auerbach's cellar. Egmont was also begun, under the stimulus of the American Rebellion. A way of escaping from his embarrassments was unexpectedly opened to him. The Duke of Weimar passed through Frankfurt both before and after his marriage, which took place on October the 3rd. He invited Goethe to stay at Weimar. It was not for his happiness or for Lili's that they should have married. She afterwards thanked him deeply for the firmness with which he overcame a temptation to which she would have yielded. At this time the smaller German courts were beginning to take an interest in German literature. Before the 7 Years' War, the whole of German culture had been French. Even now, German writers found but scant acceptance at Berlin or Vienna. The princes of the smaller states surrounded themselves with literature and art. The Duke of Brunswick had made Lessing his librarian. The Duke of Württemberg paid special attention to education. He promoted the views of Schubart, and founded the school in which Schiller was educated. Hanover offered a home to Zimmermann, and encouraged the development of Schlegel. Darmstadt was especially fortunate. Caroline, the wife of the Landgrave, had surrounded herself with a literary circle, of which Merck was the moving spirit. She had collected and privately printed the Odes of Klopstock, and her death in 1774 seemed to leave Darmstadt a desert. Her daughter Louisa seemed to have inherited something of her mother's qualities. She married on October the 3rd, 1775, the young Duke of Weimar, who was just of age. She was of the house of Brunswick, and after 2 years of marriage had been left a widow at 19 with 2 sons. She committed their education to Count Goetz, a prominent character in the history of the time. She afterwards summoned Wieland to instruct the elder, and Knebel to instruct the younger. Upon this society Goethe rose like a star. From the moment of his arrival he became the inseparable companion of the Grand Duke. The first months at Weimar was spent in a wild round of pleasure. Goethe was treated as a guest. In the autumn, journeys, rides, shooting parties; in the winter, balls, masquerades, skating parties by torchlight, dancing at peasants' feasts, filled up their time. Evil reports flew about Germany. We may believe that no decencies were disregarded except the artificial restrictions of courtly etiquette. In the spring he had to decide whether he would go or stay. In April the Duke gave him the little garden by the side of the Ilm. In June he invested him with the title, so important to Germans, of Geheimlegationsrat, with a seat and voice in the Privy Council and an income. Goethe's life was at no time complete without the influence of a noble-hearted woman. This he found in Charlotte von Stein, a lady of the court, wife of the Master of the Horse. The close of 1779 was occupied by a winter journey to Switzerland. 2 days were spent at Frankfurt with Goethe's parents. Sesenheim was visited and left with satisfaction and contentment. At Strasbourg they found as to Lessing. The repertoire of the Weimar theatre was stocked with pieces of solid merit which long held their place. In August 1792 he accompanied the Duke to the campaign in the Ardennes. In 1793 he went with his master to the siege of Mainz. Goethe took the old German epic of Reynard the Fox, with which he had long been familiar, and which, under the guise of animals, represents the conflicting passions of men, and rewrote it. Thus far he had produced but little since his return from Italy. His friendship with Schiller was now to begin, an alliance which, in the closeness of its intimacy and its deep effect on the character of both friends, has scarcely a parallel in literary history. If Schiller was not at this time at the height of his reputation, he had written many of the works which have made his name famous. He was 10 years younger than Goethe. The Räuber plays the same part in his literary history as Goetz plays in that of Goethe. This had been followed by Fiesco and Kabale und Liebe. In 1787 he settled at Weimar. The first effect of Schiller's influence on Goethe was the completion of Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship. It stands in the first rank of Goethe's writings. A more solid result of the friendship between the poets was the production of Hermann und Dorothea. The latter half of 1798 was occupied with a tour in Switzerland. Before its commencement he visited his mother at Frankfurt for the last time, and presented to her his wife and his son. In the beginning of 1805 Goethe was convinced that either he or Schiller would die in that year. In January they were both seized with illness. Schiller was the first to recover, and, visiting Goethe in his sick room, fell on his neck and kissed him with intense emotion. On April 29th they saw each other for the last time. Schiller was on his way to the theatre, whither Goethe was too ill to accompany him. They parted at the door of Schiller's house. Schiller died on the evening of the 9th of May. No one dared to tell Goethe the sad news, but he saw on the faces of those who surrounded him that Schiller must be very ill. On the morrow of Schiller's death, when his wife entered his room, he said, "Is it not true that Schiller was very ill yesterday?" She began to sob. He then cried, "He is dead." "Thou hast spoken it thyself," she answered. Goethe turned aside and covered his weeping eyes with his hands. Since that time Schiller and Goethe have been inseparable in the minds of their countrymen. On October 14th, 1806, the Battle of Jena was fought. The court had fled from Weimar. On the 15th, Napoleon and Goethe met. It was at the Congress of Erfurt, where the sovereigns and princes of Europe were assembled. Goethe's presence was commanded by the Duke. He was invited to an audience on October 2nd. The Emperor sat at a large round table eating his breakfast. He beckoned Goethe to approach him. He asked how old he was, expressed his wonder at the freshness of his appearance, said that he had read Werther through 7 times, and made some acute remarks on the management of the plot. Then, after an interruption, he said that tragedy ought to be the school of kings and peoples, that there was no subject worthier of treatment than the death of Caesar, which Voltaire had treated insufficiently. A great poet would have given prominence to Caesar's plans for the regeneration of the world, and shown what a loss mankind had suffered by his murder. The idea of writing Faust seems to have come to Goethe in his earliest manhood. He was brooding over it at the same time with Goetz von Berlichingen. Faust justly stands at the head of all Goethe's works. Founded on a well-known popular tale, indebted for its interest and pathos to incidents of universal experience, it deals with the deepest problems which can engage the mind of man. In 1809 he finished the Elective Affinities. It was natural at the beginning of a new course of life that Goethe should write an account of his past existence. The study of his collected poems made it apparent to him how necessary it was to furnish a key by which they might be understood. These various causes led to the composition of Dichtung und Wahrheit, Poetry and Truth, an autobiographical history of the poet's life from his birth till his settlement at Weimar. This work is the cause of much embarrassment to the poet's biographers. Where it ought to be the most trustworthy source of information, it is most misleading. Once more, in his old age, Goethe came under the sovereignty of a woman. She was Marianne von Willemer, the newly married wife of a Frankfurt banker. Goethe made her acquaintance in a journey which he took in the Rhine country. The correspondence between Goethe and Marianne was published in 1877. It extends almost to the day of his death, and includes letters from Eckermann, giving an account of his last moments. The last 12 years of Goethe's life, when he had passed his 70th birthday, were occupied by his criticisms on the literature of foreign countries, by the Wanderjahre and the second part of Faust. He was the literary dictator of Germany and of Europe. The Wanderjahre contains some of Goethe's most beautiful conceptions: the flight into Egypt, the description of the pedagogic province, the parable of the 3 reverences. The second part of Faust has been a battlefield of controversy since its publication, and demands fuller attention. Its fate may be compared with that of the latest works of Beethoven. For a long time it was regarded as impossible to understand, and as not worth understanding, the production of a great artist whose faculties had been impaired by age. By degrees, it has by careful labour become intelligible to us, and the conviction is growing that it is the deepest and most important work of the author's life. He had much to darken his latter days. His wife had died in 1816. He felt her loss bitterly. The Duchess Amalia had died 8 years before. He had now to undergo bitterer experiences when he was less able to bear them. Frau von Stein, with whom he had renewed his friendship, if not his love, died in January 1827, and in June 1828 he lost the companion of his youth, the Grand Duke Karl August, who died suddenly away from Weimar. We must pass to the closing scenes. On Thursday, March the 15th, 1832, he spent his last cheerful and happy day. He awoke the next morning with a chill. From this he gradually recovered, and on Monday was so much better that he designed to begin his regular work on the next day. But in the middle of the night he woke with a deathly coldness, which extended from his hands over his body, and which took many hours to subdue. It then appeared that the lungs were attacked, and that there was no hope of his recovery. Goethe did not anticipate death. He sat fully clothed in his armchair, made attempts to reach his study, spoke confidently of his recovery, and of the walks he would take in the fine April days. His daughter-in-law Ottilie tended him faithfully. On the morning of the 22nd his strength gradually left him. He sat slumbering in his armchair, holding Ottilie's hand. Her name was constantly on his lips. His mind occasionally wandered, at one time to his beloved Schiller, at another to a fair female head with black curls, some passion of his youth. His last words were an order to his servant to open the second shutter, to let in more light. After this he traced with his forefinger letters in the air. At 11:30 in the day he drew himself, without any sign of pain, into the left corner of his armchair, and went so peacefully to sleep that it was long before the watchers knew that his spirit was really gone. He is buried in the Grand Ducal vault, where the bones of Schiller are also laid. End of section 1.